Chapter 1351. Elaine and her father were even more awkward. Nolan didn't seem to want to hear what happened in college, so he cut straight to the point. You can be blunt, Mr. Xavier. Even if we were course mates, we weren't that close, so there's no need to pretend to be friends. His intentions were clear. Trying to use their relationship as acquaintances to help Beyond Tech was pointless because they weren't close, and Nolan couldn't care less about that. Edward understood, so he changed his tune. Beyond Tech is facing some financial issues, and I heard that you took computer science in college and you're versed in technology, so we'd like to ask for your help. Nolan crossed his legs and leaned back while crossing his arms. I don't waste time on failed ventures. There's nothing about Beyond Tech that intrigues me. Edward clenched his jaw because he didn't know what to say. Elaine stood up. Mr. Goldman, I know that Beyond Tech is nothing in your eyes because the IT companies under Black Gold are bigger than Beyond Tech, but we're not too far behind when it comes to software. The usage of Contact exceeds other social platforms yearly, with hundreds of millions of views. We currently have over 20 million users, and the app is a result of the hard work of all Beyond Tech staff for over a decade. My dad just doesn't want it to leave the market. Nolan didn't answer, but seemed to be deep in thought. Maisie looked toward Elaine and her father. She didn't know much about social apps, but she knew that the apps were popular now, and Contact is one of the newer platforms. On top of connecting with friends, video viewing, and live streams, just like other platforms, the users could build their own fan base and share their work, so students loved it. She looked toward Nolan. Beyond Tech seems to be pretty outstanding when it comes to software and apps. If we worked together, we would be able to help each other out. Why don't you think about it? Edward and Elaine both looked at Maisie with surprise. Nolan chuckled and leaned closer to her. What's on your mind? Maisie smiled. I'm thinking about the benefits you could get. Contact has captured the market's demand and is well known and loved by its users. It would be a shame if it was taken down. There are plenty of skilled people in the market, but their experience is limited. If a company with skills and experience reaches out to work with us, it will help Black Gold. Getting an experienced partner would be better than hiring a new person. All the job markets would prefer people with experience. No company would want to spend years training an IT genius because they might not stay. Nobody would want the employee that they had trained well to go to another company. And as for most corporations, an experienced partner would be more mature than a fresh graduate and would be better at handling problems. Not all recruits could handle that, so experienced elites were very sought after in the IT industry. Nolan smiled and played with her hair. I'm really glad that you're thinking about helping me. Chapter 1352. Maisie smiled. We have 3 big spenders at home. Of course, I have to help you out. Nolan looked toward the father and daughter. My wife has asked me to think about it, so I will. Edward was very surprised but smiled. Thank you, Mrs. Goldman, and thank you, Mr. Goldman, for giving us a chance. After Quincy walked them out, Maisie stood up. I should leave. Before she could finish, Nolan pulled her into his arms and buried his face in her hair. Leave to go where? She cried, back to my office. Nolan was in heat. Don't even think of going back today. At Morwich. Tanner brought Noah to the zoo. Noah had his arms around his neck while he looked around excitedly. He was curious about all the animals because he had never been to a zoo. He asked question after question, but Tanner answered all of them patiently. Pearl followed behind them. It was the first time she saw her son so happy, so she didn't want to interrupt them. The zoo was crowded, so she lost sight of Tanner and Noah when she snapped back. While she was looking around, a hand held hers. She paused, then turned around and saw Tanner carrying Noah with one arm. He frowned. Keep up. Pearl looked away. I'm sorry. Tanner held her hand. Let's go. He held her hand and walked in front while carrying their child on the other arm. Pearl's eyes floated to their hands. She pressed her lips together and didn't struggle to get free. They arrived at the penguin section, and Tanner let Noah down. The kid ran to the glass and watched the penguins. His eyes were wide and shone with excitement. "Mommy, there are so many penguins here." Pearl smiled and nodded. Noah sneezed, and his snot shot out. She immediately took out some napkins and squatted down. "Did you kick your blankie away again last night?" Noah blew his nose and shook his head. "No." Pearl looked toward Tanner, who was taking pictures, then paused. Noah rushed over to grab his legs. "Daddy, pictures." Tanner rubbed his head. "All right, let's take one together." He looked around and asked someone to help them. The person was very friendly and immediately took the phone. Tanner carried Noah and put out his other hand to hug Pearl. Pearl looked a little awkward in front of the camera. "So the person said, could the lady please smile?" Tanner turned to look at Pearl, who looked at the camera and smiled. After the picture was taken, he returned the phone to Tanner. Tanner thanked the man and went through the photos. They looked very much like a family together. When they returned to Maple Lane, Kamala was waiting for them in the yard. Noah ran toward Kamala. "Grandma." Kamala caught him and smiled. "Did you have fun?" He nodded and laughed. "Yes, with Daddy and Mommy." Kamala brought him into the house and left Tanner and Pearl alone outside. Pearl looked around and pressed her lips together. "Do you not plan to go back?" He had been in Morwich for half a month because of their child. Tanner held her hand. "Do you want me to go back?" Pearl parted her lips but didn't say anything. Chapter 1353. Tanner slowly spoke. "Noah needs a complete family and me." Pearl paused, her chest heaving, but pulled her hand out of his grasp. "I don't want to get married." She no longer had the courage to go through marriage. Tanner's eyes lost hope, but he understood she didn't want to forgive him. He said, "We won't have to get married if you don't want to. We'll do it if or when you want to. Pearl, the decision is in your hands. I won't force it." Tanner touched her face, which looked cold because he wanted to warm her up. Pearl looked around and took a deep breath. "I'm not worth the effort." "I think you are." Tanner got closer and rubbed his hand on her cheek. "Pearl, you and Noah bring meaning to my life." Pearl froze before looking into his eyes. "Tanner, if we got married and you had a tainted wife, you would need to hear people talking behind your back. Do you think that's a marriage you want?" "I don't care." Tanner touched her face and stared into her eyes. "I don't care what others say, as long as I love my wife." Pearl looked at him but didn't say anything. Tanner kissed her cheek and gave her a peck on her lips after seeing that she didn't flinch. The touch shocked her, so she immediately pushed him away and took deep breaths. "I'm sorry." Tanner saw that she was shaking and was afraid that he had scared her. "Don't worry. I can wait." He would wait for her to be all right with his touch, no matter how long that would take. After 3 days, Quincy brought the agreement to Beyond Tech. The assistant had already prepared some tea in the office. Xavier sat on the couch and read through the agreement. After a long time, Quincy, who sat across from him, said, "You can bring up any objections." Edward smiled. "I have no objections." He picked up his pen and signed, then handed it back to Quincy. Quincy closed the file, stood up, and put out his hand. "Here's to a great partnership." Edward shook his hand. When Quincy was leaving, he remembered something. "By the way, I wonder if it's possible to get Mr. and Mrs. Goldman for dinner. I would like to thank Mrs. Goldman." Quincy turned to look at him. "I'll check with Mr. Goldman." Edward nodded. "Thanks." At Seoul, Lucy came to the office to report on the company's sales performance. In 3 years, Lucy had matured a lot compared to when she first joined the company and was no longer a little girl in the corporate world. After listening to her report, Maisie nodded happily. "I was right about you." Lucy blushed when she was praised. "No, it was because you mentored me well." Maisie crossed her fingers, placed her chin on them, and smiled. Be confident. You wouldn't have improved as much even if I taught you well, if not, because you're smart, to begin with, right? Lucy smiled and nodded. Thank you. At that moment, Maisie got a call from Nolan. Honey, I'm at the office. Lucy knew it was Nolan, so she quietly walked out but overheard their conversation. Mr. Xavier wants to have dinner with us? Nolan smiled. It's to thank you for giving them a chance. Chapter 1354. Nolan hadn't planned to work with Beyond Tech, especially when they tried to use his relationship with Elaine. He didn't want another situation like the Hannigan. Nathaniel had tried to introduce Maisie to him under the guise of a partnership when he lost his memories. If there were any underlying motives, he wouldn't consider a partnership, even if it were with a great company. However, Beyond Tech was open and good at reading people. Since Maisie was interested, he had agreed on behalf of her. Maisie smiled. I'll go where my dear brings me. Nolan smiled and agreed. After the call ended, Lucy slowly turned around. Miss Vanderbilt, which Mr. Xavier were you talking about? Maisie smiled and answered, from Beyond Tech. Lucy's expression slightly changed. Maisie noticed that and squinted. What's wrong? Lucy snapped back to her senses, scratched her head, and smiled. It's nothing. I was just curious. I'm going back to work. The moment she left the office and closed the door, her smile disappeared, and her expression turned dark. Maisie and Nolan showed up at the restaurant at 7 p.m. Edward had booked a private room in a high-end restaurant. He was there with his daughter and his wife. When they saw Maisie and Nolan, the Xaviers all stood up and greeted them warmly. Mr. and Mrs. Goldman, take a seat. Nolan sat next to Edward, and Maisie sat next to him. The women of the Xavier family sat on the left side of Edward and were facing them. Edward happily handed the menu over. We haven't ordered anything because we don't know what you enjoy. We wanted for you to be here when we ordered. Nolan didn't take the menu, but calmly said, you're the family leader and a senior, so you can decide on the food. We don't have any allergies or preferences. After Nolan said that, Edward didn't push. I'll get their signature dish then. It's quite good. He got the server to take their order and asked Nolan, Mr. Goldman, do both of you drink? She doesn't. Maisie looked at Nolan and frowned. I can drink a little. Nolan chuckled and played along. Fine, a little then. Jenna Xavier couldn't help but smile when she saw their interaction. Your relationship is really as great as the rumors. Rumors about Nolan had mostly started after getting married. He had become the standard for the socialites in Bassburg when picking a partner, and they were the dream couple everyone wanted to become. Maisie looked at Jenna. She wasn't as overbearing as the other women in the circle, but was instead gentle and kind. She didn't wear a lot of expensive jewelry to show her status and looked simple compared to the other ladies. She smiled. Thanks, Mrs. Xavier. I didn't know that you're quite young. Edward was already in his 60s, but Jenna looked like she was in her 40s, a young wife. Chapter 1355. Anna was surprised, then looked toward Edward and smiled. Edward made it lively during their dinner while Elaine had a few things to say when the food was served. Nolan rarely spoke when dining, and Maisie would usually be the one speaking. She noticed that Jenna had no interactions with Elaine. After dinner, Edward walked them to the door. Maisie said goodbye to them politely and got into the car with Nolan. The car slowly drove away while she looked into the side mirror. I felt that Jenna didn't really blend in. Nolan casually unbuttoned his jacket, tilted his head, and smiled. You were paying attention to that? I just found it odd. Maisie leaned on his shoulder. Jenna had to look at her husband before speaking and didn't interact with her daughter as though she was an outsider. When the driver heard that, he said, I heard that this is Mr. Xavier's second wife. Miss Xavier was from the first wife who he divorced many years ago. Maisie leaned forward with a curious expression. why did they get a divorce? The driver noticed the dark eyes behind him, so he awkwardly smiled. I'm not sure, ma'am. Maisie pouted. Elaine was Nolan's age, so how could her mother be in her 40s? She was just a stepmother. Nolan put out his arm and pulled her into his arms. Since when were you so interested in gossip? Maisie looked up at him and smiled. Don't you know that gossiping is every woman's hobby? Nolan touched her hair and smiled. I do now. He leaned in and smiled. You're very nosy too. Maisie got up in annoyance, but smiled. I'm going to ignore you if you keep calling me out. Nolan laughed and hugged her. All right, I'll stop. The next day, Elaine was doing some shopping with her close friends. Since news of Black Gold and Beyond Tech's partnership had spread, her best friends were jealous that her family could work with Black Gold. Elaine walked into a luxury boutique and was going through the racks when her friend got close to her while looking curious. Elaine, weren't you friends with Mr. Goldman in college? Did he work with you because you know each other? We're just in the same course. We're not close. Elaine had no expression. Another woman smiled. Did you have dinner with him? Did you manage to get his phone number? Elaine put the shirt back on the rack. We had dinner, but Mrs. Goldman was there too. The woman was sad. He brought her along for dinner. I guess he really loves her. However, the other friend disagreed. I think she was just worried he would be in contact with other women and followed along. If my husband was rich and good-looking, I'd follow him everywhere too. Elaine didn't say anything. After they left the mall, a car slowly drove past them. She saw who was driving, so she turned to speak to them. I have something after this. You go ahead. The two women understood and left. Chapter 1356. Elaine walked toward the car. The car drove into the car park. After Lucy parked the car, she came out and closed the door. As soon as she turned around, she saw Elaine walking toward her. It has been a long time, Lucy. It seems like you're leading a pretty good life. You even have a new car. Lucy did not expect to run into Elaine here. The smile on her face disappeared. So? It's not like I'm spending your family's money. Just when she was about to leave, Elaine stopped her. It has been 3 years. You don't even care about how your mother is living in our house? When Elaine talked about her mother, Lucy averted her gaze and fell silent. When she turned 15, her mother remarried a businessman. Since then, she and her mother had been living with the Xaviers. She had also acknowledged her stepfather as her father and changed her surname. However, she knew that she and her mother had always been outsiders. Her mother was obedient to the man and tried her best to be a good wife. Although Lucy had become the daughter of the Xaviers and her stepfather had paid for her education, he did not allow her to tell anyone that she was part of the Xaviers. Even her mother was prohibited from acknowledging that she was her daughter in front of people. In order to find a good husband for her and save her from the same miserable life as she had organized the blind date 3 years ago. Elaine studied Lucy for a while and approached her. Who's the sugar daddy? You didn't tell your mother about it, did you? Lucy was stunned. What? Elaine frowned and continued. This purse cost about $3,000. How could you get so much money if you didn't have a sugar daddy? Although I'm not your biological sister, and I don't have an obligation to tell you what's right or wrong, you should also think about your mother, right? Lucy did not know why Elaine would come to such a conclusion. She did not want her to go back and tell her mother some nonsense, so she said, "Don't be ridiculous. I bought this purse with the money I earned myself." What kind of job is it? It's none of your business. Lucy flung her aside and went back into the building. Elaine followed behind her secretly, and she was slightly shocked when she saw her walking toward the branch of Seoul jewelry. At the Xavier mansion, Edward was reading the newspaper in front of the desk while Jenna was making him tea. He flipped through the newspapers, and then he suddenly thought of something. He put the newspaper on the side and picked up a cup of tea. It's been a few years, and I don't think I've heard you mention your daughter again. Jenna was momentarily stunned before she smiled and said, I have been keeping in touch with her privately. You're her mother. If you have been keeping in touch with her, then you should call her back for dinner once in a while, Edward said seriously. He did not want other people to know her identity, but it did not mean he did not allow them to see each other. When Elaine returned to the house, she happened to hear the conversation between her father and Jenna. Before she could say anything, Jenna rose to her feet and said with a smile, You're back, Elaine. I'll go prepare dinner then. When Jenna passed by her, Elaine crossed her arms in front of her chest and said, I saw your daughter today. Jenna was stunned again. However, she did not say anything and went into the kitchen. Elaine took a look at Jenna and then sat on the couch. Edward asked her, If you've seen Lucy, why didn't you ask her to come back for dinner? She's busy, Elaine replied. Edward asked, What does she do for a living? Elaine picked up a cup. She hesitated for a few seconds and replied, No idea. Edward did not press on. He looked at her and said, Elaine, if you have time, go mingle with Mr. Goldman and his wife. Becoming their friend will only bring you benefits and no harm. Chapter 1357. Elaine took a sip from the tea silently. Nobody could tell if she was listening or not. She had not wanted to go with her father to the Black Gold that day. Even though she graduated from the same college as Nolan, she was unfamiliar with him. Her father had wanted her to go because he wanted to take advantage of the relationship between her daughter and Nolan and hoped that he would give them a chance. However, he was obviously wrong. She was also well aware that her father wanted her to enter that circle solidly and gain a foothold in it. Many people wanted to work with Black Gold, but not all of them had the opportunity. When people wanted to cotton up to the Goldmans, the first target they would go after was Nolan, and they would usually ignore Nolan's wife. Her father knew how much Nolan loved his wife, so he wanted her to form a good relationship with her instead. Everyone said Maisie was just lucky for marrying Nolan. Some of them even thought that she was just a woman, and even though she worked as a jewelry designer, it didn't mean that she could provide any help to Nolan, and she could never represent Black Gold. However, she was the only one who saw through the truth. Why did Nolan love no one but Maisie? Why was Nolan so obedient to her? She did not just depend on Nolan, and she was unique in her own way. She did not have to become a housewife. Not only did she have her own business, but she could also make decisions for your husband's benefit. Many people in this world sought equality between men and women. However, only a minority of them could really do so, and Nolan did not ask his wife to do what a woman should do because she was a woman, just like her father did. Instead, they achieved true equality. Not only were they husband and wife, but they could also be partners in work. Many men did not wish their wives to be better than them, but little did they know that their attitude decided whether a woman wanted to be pushy or not. When men became unreliable, women could only count on themselves. She lowered her head and replied, Okay. 2 days later, at Seoul, Seoul had just launched a new season of jewelry. They wanted to invite several popular celebrities to become their spokesperson, and Maisie left it to the advertising planning department to decide during the meeting. After the meeting was over, Maisie came out of the meeting room. Lucy walked up to her and said, Miss Vanderbilt. She turned around to look at Lucy and replied, Yeah? Lucy scratched her cheek and said, I may have to take 2 days off. Without asking her the reason, Maisie replied with a smile, Sure. Go ahead. A smile broke across Lucy's face. Thank you, Miss Vanderbilt. At that moment, Sadie came over and whispered something into her ear. Miss Xavier? Maisie was dumbfounded. Sadie nodded. I already asked her to wait for you in the reception room. When Lucy heard the name Xavier, her heart skipped a beat. Is it Elaine? Meanwhile, Elaine was waiting for Maisie in the reception room. When she saw Sadie and Maisie, she rose to her feet and nodded at them with a smile on her face. Mrs. Goldman. It's okay. Have a seat. Maisie sat opposite her and asked, Is there anything I can help you with, Miss Xavier? Maisie was kind of curious why Elaine would come to her. The feeling she gave her was different from those women who got their heads banged up when they saw Nolan. That day at Black Gold, she had been under the impression that Elaine would express her love for Nolan because Nolan was her course mate in college. However, the things she had said on behalf of Beyond Tech Corporation were from her heart. Chapter 1358. Not only that, but Elaine did not take the chance and curry favor with Nolan when they were having dinner that night. Apparently, she was not interested in Nolan. Elaine put the gift on the table and said with a smile, "To express my gratitude, I hope you can keep this, Mrs. Goldman." Maisie knew it was expensive, judging from the gift box alone. She narrowed her eyes and seemed rather perplexed. "You're welcome, Miss Xavier. However, did you not already express it at dinner the other day? So don't you think it's a little inappropriate for me to accept your gift now?" There were two meanings when it came to gift giving. The first one was to express something, while the second was to curry favor. When one wanted to express something, it could mean that they were asking for a favor. However, Elaine did not look like she was asking for a favor, but was more inclined to the second one. In other words, Elaine was currying favor with her, but she did not show it explicitly. It was within Elaine's expectation that Maisie did not take the gift. She was following her father's request to get on good terms with Maisie. It seemed a bit disrespectful to shove a gift down her throat, and it could backfire with excessive enthusiasm. After thinking for a while, Elaine decided to take a step back. "It was inconsiderate of me, and caused you to misunderstand. This gift is a small token of my appreciation. I just want to thank you for giving Beyond Technology a chance, and I'll not forget this favor from you." Maisie smiled. "This is the opportunity that you fought for Beyond Technology. I was just objectively expressing my opinion. The person who ultimately gave Beyond Technology a chance is Nolan. Honestly, if you want to express your gratitude, you don't have to give me a gift. In the future cooperation with Black Gold, I just hope that Beyond Technology can put up the end of your bargain to bring out the full benefits of this cooperation. This is the best way to thank us." Elaine was stunned. Maisie was indeed different from other women. She had a good vision and did not stick at trifles. It was no wonder that Nolan would love her so much. Elaine left after chatting with Maisie for some time. She did not take the gift along with her. After Elaine left, Maisie turned her head to look at the gift on the table. It was a little awkward to take back the gift that had been given. She couldn't reject her either, since it would also injure their relationship. She ordered Sadai to put the gift away without opening it. At night, Maisie told the matter of Elaine giving her a gift to Nolan. Nolan was sitting on the couch reading a document in his sleep robe. He looked relaxed, and after listening to Maisie, he lifted his eyelids and said, "It isn't surprising that she wants to please you, Z." "Yes, it isn't surprising." Maisie was applying facial cream to her face. She turned around to look at him and continued, "I'm just wondering why she is doing that." She looked like she wanted to curry favor with her, but she did not show excessive passion when meeting her this afternoon. It did not seem to be her intention, or she was not good at it. Why was she doing it if she was not good at it? Was she trying to get something from her? Maisie just wanted an answer. Nolan put the document on the table and rose to his feet to walk toward Maisie. He supported his arms on the table and leaned closer to her. "What if she's going after a benefit only you can offer her?" She squinted. "Benefit that only I can offer her?" She was not the one who cooperated with Beyond Technology. Nolan caressed her face with his finger and chuckled. "The Xaviers are smart. They know they won't get anything from me by courting me, so they turn their target to you." Understanding instantly dawned upon Maisie. She smiled and said, "So, they want to achieve a long-term cooperative relationship with you through me?" "Maybe." Nolan put his finger on her lips. Maisie got up and coiled her arms around his neck. Her fingers grazed past his chest as she said, "They've overestimated me. Do they really think that my word can sway the decision of Mr. Goldman?" Chapter 1359. Nolan wrapped his arms around Maisie's waist and pulled her closer. Can't you? Maisie was stunned for a moment and chuckled. Can I? Nolan lowered his head and landed a trail of kisses on her cheek to the corner of her lips. Yes, you can. Maisie slightly pushed him away and lifted her head to look at his handsome face. That's because you know I won't make any unreasonable demands. To make a man obedient, being unreasonable was useless. An appropriate amount of vexatiousness could improve the relationship between husband and wife, but it would only make a man feel bored when overused. Nolan chose to listen to her when it came to important matters. He gave her the amount of respect and trust she needed. People always said that men went out to work while women looked after the house. When a woman gave her husband the respect he needed, the man would reciprocate by giving her a good life. However, things were different when it came to Nolan. Regardless of whether they were outside or in the house, she gave him the respect and trust he needed, and he did the same to her. A man's dignity and pride did not entirely depend on his wife. Instead, it depended on the man himself. She would naturally be willing to back off if he respected his wife. If a man refused to respect his wife, how could he expect his wife to give him respect in front of the people? Many times, a wife threw a tantrum and made things difficult for her husband when she found out that her husband had cheated on her. Nolan chuckled deeply and turned around to put Maisie on the table. Well, it's fine if you want to make an unreasonable demand now. She lifted her eyebrows and put her hand on his waist. You mean now? Nolan lowered his head to kiss her. You're so naughty, Z. The next day, at the Xavier mansion, Lucy was pacing back and forth in the courtyard. Just when she was thinking if she should go in or not, Jenna opened the door. When she saw her standing in front of the door, she said, "What are you doing out here? Come on in." Lucy did not say anything and went into the living room with Jenna. Edward and Elaine were sitting on the couch. Jenna pushed Lucy forward and ushered her to greet them. Lucy pressed her lips thin and greeted Edward hesitantly, "Dad." Edward put the cup down and replied indifferently, "Your mom has been talking about you since you haven't returned home for several years. Since you're back today, then stay back for lunch." To make her mother happy, Lucy decided to stay for dinner. Lucy did not say anything when they were having lunch. After her mother formed a new family, she became an outsider. She couldn't blend herself in no matter how hard she tried, so she could only keep silent. Suddenly, Jenna asked, "Lucy, Elaine said she ran into you the other day. Who are you working for right now?" Lucy was stunned and jerked her head up to look at Elaine. Elaine had never liked her and her mother. She used to cause her some trouble from time to time when they were studying. Therefore, they were not on good terms. She did not know if Elaine had said something to her mother, so she wanted to see her reaction first. However, Elaine just glanced at her and did not say anything. Then, Lucy replied, "I'm working as a salesperson in a company." Jenna nodded and continued. "Is the work hard? Are you tired?" Lucy was her own daughter, and it went without saying that she was worried about her. She knew she owed her daughter a lot, so she wanted her to marry a good husband. She did not want her to go through the same miserable life as she had. Before Lucy could say anything, Elaine chuckled and said, "I don't think she's tired. Judging from her salary, she should be at least a manager now, right?" Lucy's heart skipped a beat. Does she know something? When Edward heard what Elaine said, he lifted his head and looked at Lucy. A manager? Which company are you working for? Chapter 1360. Lucy lowered her head and pressed her lips thin. Seeing her reaction, Jenna was worried that Edward would get angry, so she nudged Lucy. "Your father is talking to you." Just when Lucy was about to say something, Elaine suddenly chimed in, "It's just a small company." "There's nothing to ask, Dad." After hearing what his daughter said, Edward nodded. Honestly, he was not interested in whatever Lucy was doing. If she really were the manager of a big corporation, it would mean that his stepdaughter was still rather useful. After all, profits and gains were the priority of businessmen. Lucy looked at Elaine, but Elaine paid her no mind. Lucy did not want to stay after she had finished lunch. Jenna walked her to the entrance. Before she left, Jenna grabbed her hand and said, "Lucy, are you mad with me?" Lucy was not someone who could hold grudges. When she said she was not mad anymore. After all, she had grown up now, and she could understand her mother's choice. "Mom, do you regret it?" she asked. Jenna was stunned for a moment. She stroked her belly, but she did not say anything in return. Lucy did not say anything more and turned around to leave. After walking far from the Xavier mansion, a car suddenly stopped beside Lucy. The window was rolled down, and Elaine was sitting in the driving seat. "Since you bought a car, why didn't you drive here? If your mom sees that you bought a car and your life isn't as hard as she thinks, maybe she won't force you to go on a blind date anymore." Lucy turned her head around to look at her. "I just don't want to drive here." Elaine unlocked the car and said, "Get on. I'll drive you home." Lucy hesitated for a while. Since she had something to ask Elaine as well, she got into the car. "What were you doing at Seoul yesterday?" "I went to see Mrs. Goldman, or I should say, your boss?" Elaine chuckled. "Seems like your boss is rather good to you." She knew it. Lucy lowered her head and continued. "Then why you? Don't get me wrong. If my dad learns that you're working as a manager at Seoul now, it won't be good for me if he thinks you're capable and starts to appreciate you. I'm sure you know that my father can only have one daughter. If your mother didn't marry my father, he would love me even more." Elaine chimed in, cutting her short. There was no expression on her face or any hatred in her words. Her parents had gotten a divorce, and her father married another woman. Could she resent other people? No, she could only resent her father. He was the one who had destroyed her beautiful and perfect family. As a result, she did not have any faith in marriage and was afraid of marriage. Lucy lowered her head. Although she and Elaine were not on good terms, Elaine just did not like her and her mother. She would criticize them or speak to them harshly from time to time, but she had never done anything to hurt them. After a long while, Lucy sighed. "Your father has only had one daughter from the beginning." Elaine laughed. "What if your mother gets pregnant? Even though she's old, my father still wants a son. I'm already 30 years old. Don't you think it's ridiculous for me to become a sister at my age?" Lucy was shocked. She recalled that her mother had touched her belly when she was seeing her out. "Could it be that?" Elaine continued. "Do you think it's worth it for a woman to risk her own life and have a baby in her 40s? When my mother told my father that she didn't want to have another baby, my father said she was selfish. He criticized her for not giving consideration to her husband and the continuation of the Xaviers. My mom married him to be his wife, not his nanny or a baby-producing tool. When she gave birth to me, she had a massive hemorrhage due to difficult labor. She nearly died, but my father didn't even consider her feelings.